This week on the Sports Initiative podcast, I sit down with coach developer for USA Hockey, Jim Haverstrom. He discusses the transition away from traditional coaching to a more constraints-led approach, the pathway for ice hockey players within the country, as well as the differences he's seen in the international coaching environment compared to the US. As always, if you enjoy this podcast, please make sure you share it with friends and family. Right. As we caught up off air there, Jim, I know that you're going to rub salt into the wound for a lot of UK people that it's a nice 80 degrees outside and nice and sunny in Florida. But how are things your end? Are you all good?
Everything's going really well.
Perfect. So, as I said to you a minute ago as well, excited to have you on. First ice hockey person, been a really hard nut to crack in terms of getting into the industry and stuff. But I think a really interesting conversation to have in terms of skill development, but also the game and how you structure it, different roles and all of that type of stuff. And obviously with some of the experiences that you've had, I think this would be a really, really fascinating conversation. For people that maybe don't know you, do you just want to give us a kind of an overview of who you are and what you do?
Yeah, I've been involved with youth hockey for about 23 years as a hockey director. Before that, I coached for 4 or 5 years before that. And before that, I was a musician. But it was I think in some ways, a pretty good transfer because being a musician is very similar to being an athlete. You're in a performance setting, you have to perform under pressure. It's creative. So in many ways, and you're using, all sorts of different coordinating all different sorts of muscles in your body. So it's very similar. But as I started out as a hockey director with limited knowledge, just like anyone else, I was lucky that I thought I was progressive, and that I would look to other areas. I didn't look just what we were doing in North America. I would study what they were doing in the Czech Republic at the time, or it was still the Soviet Union, just in Sweden, because it seemed like they were creating players, especially like Sweden, they were creating more NHL players with less people playing. And it's like, what are they doing that is different that I could try to incorporate? And over those years, I've been to 4 or 5 different programs. I was in Colorado Springs, where USA Hockey is based, when they brought out the ADM model, which was the American Developmental Model, which was a big shift in the way we trained kids. And along with that, I also became a coach developer for USA Hockey, where I would give, different workshops to our coaches to give them ideas of, better coaching concepts, and which has been a lot of fun because it's been fun to watch USA Hockey change how we are delivering that message to our coaches, where we went from this is what to coach to how to coach, which was a big, huge shift in the way we were sending that message out.
Perfect. And so for people that don't have a grounding in terms of what ice hockey looks like in the States, obviously most people be aware of NHL right at the very top in terms of professional and stuff. But could you just talk through us what like a traditional journey may look like for an individual who, starts out at 5, 6 years old wanting to play hockey, to if they were to make it to NHL, what that pathway actually looks like?
Yeah, it's very unique for North American sports. Obviously, nobody is born with skates on, so they'll go through like a learn to skate program where they learn the basics of skating, and then they'll go to a learn to play program where they learn how to stick handle, where they learn how to do the technique of passing, where they all might skate around cones, and that's a kind of a traditional look. And then they'll progress into, what we call usually recreational leagues at first, where every kid plays the same. And from there, the recreational leagues will continue up to 16 or 17, but we start with what we call travel, where we start culling kids at 7, 6, and 7 and saying that you're elite and you get more ice, you get better, theoretically better coaching. And those kids, depending on where they live, every weekend will travel, sometimes big distances. If you're in non-traditional areas like here in Florida, you may be traveling 4 or 5 hours to play a game. If you're up in Minnesota, you travel 20 minutes, that kind of stuff. And then a lot of these travel teams, especially now, are also getting on planes 4 or 5 times a year to go play a team, play in tournaments across the country. And we tier that into what we call tier two, which usually have like A and double A levels. And then we have what we call tier one, which is your triple A, where those kids are theoretically the more competitive or the higher level of ability players. And then the ones that want to go on to play either professional or college hockey usually then have another step, which is junior hockey. So if a kid's 16, 17, 18, they'll go on and play for a junior team, and there's various tiers of that. And those tiers relate to how much a child or the player has to pay to play. They're what we call pay to play junior leagues, where you pay for everything. There's our tier two, where you get to play for free, but you have to pay for your billet, your family that you live with. And then tier one, everything is like almost like a mini pro, all your equipment, all your billet families, all that's taken care of. And so we have a lot of kids where traditionally in the United States, a basketball player, a football player will start college at 18. The junior hockey player will start college at 20, 21 sometimes. So, which is beneficial for the college coach, because he now gets a man, he gets a kid who's lived away from home, understands what it's like to live away from home, may even know how to do his laundry, that kind of stuff. So it's very different than the traditional sports, thing. Now, if a kid wants to go into the pro ranks, they may either go, through the college ranks, or they may go straight from junior and get drafted into the pro ranks and then go through the minor leagues, or go, depending on their level of ability.
Perfect. Yeah, I think it gives us a really nice ground in terms of what that pathway, etc., looks like. And then in terms of, we describe it as the larger culture, what would you say, I guess, the culture in hockey is? Is it a very experimental sport? Is it quite traditional in the way it works? Is there been a shift? What does that look like culturally in terms of hockey?
Right now, it's still, I'd say a high percentage is traditional still, but it is changing. USA Hockey is the governing body. And as a coach developer who helps, give clinics, we are definitely doing a shift from the idea of teaching kids to learn by going through around cones, skating in lines, to now a more ecological approach. I mean, in our level 5, the dreaded word ecological dynamics was even brought up, and our speakers were geared toward that. Stuart Armstrong was one of our keynote speakers. And then I would say 80% of the breakout groups and speakers were talking about how do we learn, what is skill, as opposed to going around cones, is skill being a golfer who what they do is they're a long driver, but they don't play the game, that kind of stuff was the idea of how do we get kids to learn. We did a lot of off-ice stuff where we played little games like this might teach a player now, hey, what is this teaching the player? This is teaching the player to, get open, to move, to think. So we're really trying to push that. And I think some of the younger coaches are starting to grasp onto that. And even some of the ones at that level 5, there was a lot of coaches who had never been exposed to this kind of training who were saying like, this makes sense. So I see as we will get more progressive, but for those coaches that haven't been exposed to it, it's still going to be, take time.
Yeah, and it seems like a similar journey to, I think, that a lot of sports have been on, in terms of that quite drill orientated, in terms of, yeah, if we do this and it's going to get better at their passing, rather than giving them an opportunity to explore that within the setting. In terms of how within the country, or compared to other countries, as you mentioned earlier, do you see a difference in play styles or capabilities? I know, for example, I'm a San Antonio Spurs fan, and Greg Popovich, for a long period of time, mentioned how they used to go abroad because it was far more pass orientated, and it allowed the foreign players or international players to have the understanding of how to create space, utilize it, and shift the ball, whereas American basketball had become more 1v1 orientated, which in ISOs is fine, but then presented challenges within their system. So from a, I guess, a skill development perspective, did you see differences between areas of the country or compared to international arenas? What did that look like?
I saw a lot of difference in international. Certain countries, what's interesting to me is certain countries like Finland all of a sudden became relatively dominant for the amount of players they were putting out. So they had actually gone back in and redone how they train players. And their idea was, we're not getting enough players to the NHL markets, and so they broke down everything they were doing and decided that they would develop as many players as possible at every age. And their feeling was that since we don't have many players, we better develop them all because we don't know who's going to be the best player later on. And that we're going to develop them to be hockey players, not just like hockey robots, and same with Sweden, where I noticed we had a lot of Swedish kids come over for some summer camps, and they would approach these little 2v2 games like way over the heads of our kids. And they weren't necessarily more technically skilled. They just moved. They loved to compete. It was like, this is what they were used to doing all the time. And they move the puck a lot quicker. So I stopped thinking about it. It's like, okay, why? And part of it is because that's the way their practices were set up. I remember having coaches come to me and complain that their team the passing in the game was awful. I'd go watch their practice, and they're doing these really nice scripted passing drills where there's nobody in the way, and they're looking really good in practice, but it wasn't, going over to the game, and they were wondering why, and it's like, well, put somebody in the way. And as silly as this sounds, as coaches, we learn a lot of things by mistake. And I remember I was teaching like little kids, and we always have these things with little kids. We'll line them up 5 feet apart from each other, and they pass the puck going back and forth, and pucks are literally going everywhere. Nobody's catching a pass. Nobody's passing it right. And by accident, I skated through them. Now, the first time they kind of hit my skates, and after that, every pass was like tape to tape. And I'm like, why? I realized that, well, they had to lift their heads up and they had to look and make a decision. And not only did the passes get more accurate, I started looking at their technique, and their technique got way better because they weren't thinking about it. And that's when I started thinking that, what they were doing over in Europe makes way more sense, because now the kids are actually playing the game, learning the technique, but learning to move it into a game quickly. So that way, and to do that along with trying to develop every player and spend as much time and effort with kids who are theoretically still playing in our rec leagues at 10 and 11 and 12, just increases the player pool.
So it sounds like from a European perspective in particular, they kind of did more small-sided games, as we would call them in soccer, if you like, or football. And so kind of isolate it off 2v2s, 3v3, 1v1, and allowing them to explore in those environments. And you can obviously make pitches bigger, smaller, and do that. What, I guess, if you're looking at traditionally, what would a practice look like in the States? Like, obviously, what I'm conscious of is you have rink time with other people in and around it. You can have multiple groups. It's obviously going to be not cheap with all the gear and stuff. So what would a traditional practice actually look like? And how did these small-sided games then challenge what that framework was?
A traditional practice would kind of look like, okay, we're going to start off with 10 or 15 minutes of skating. That may or may not have the puck. It could be that we're all going to skate around circles. One I used to love was they'd skate around one circle, go to the next, go to the one in the middle, and then go one down the other end. And by the time they got to the last circle, nobody's skating fast at all anymore. Or they get in lines, and we're going to practice this technique, and we're going to practice that technique. And we're going to make it perfect. Although when I would watch, 99% of the kids wouldn't be doing it necessarily perfect because there's so many kids going, there's no correction. Then you would could be, depending on the age, now you got a puck, we're going to go around a bunch of cones because we're going to, learn how to stick handle. We're going to learn how to make turns with the puck. Very often after that, you'd have 5-on-0 play, 3-on-0 play, then maybe go into 3-on-2, you go into 2-on-1 type play. And there'd be either a small area game at the end or like a full ice scrimmage. A lot of scripted, a lot of this is what you do. And even in the games, it'd be like a lot of the times is the coach is sitting there stopping it right away. You guys are in the wrong place. I'm going to fix it. I'm the coach. And not that players didn't get good. Some players, players got good. It's just that they probably could have got better, or more of them could have got better. There weren't a lot of decisions made in practice. And that was, I know coaches would joke, this kid is the world's best cone player. We've never seen a kid better going around cones. We used to joke that here in Florida that our kids are great cones players. And up until 10 years old or 11, you can win often with cones players because they're just faster. They're more skilled, as far as having to be able to skate around somebody. But when the game got older, when you had to think and make decisions and compete, those players would struggle.
So when you're now adding in the more small-sided game type stuff, what would the sessions now look like for those coaches that have really embraced this type of training methods, or really on board with actually we want high levels of decision making, we want to make it a little bit more chaotic, we're going to try and reduce the number of predetermined skill practices, if you like? What would their now, I guess, more nuanced practice look like?
Excellent question. Like you'll see some coaches, they may start out with everybody has a puck and you're from the blue line down, and now you're skating and you're just skating around, keeping your head up, and then you may add somebody's trying to knock the puck away. So they're still skating, they're making tight turns, they're going forwards, they're going backwards. So they're working on a lot of their skating, but in a game like context. From that, or they may open, depending on the coach, they might do like keep away games. Like my team needs to get the puck to that side. We have to pass it one time on our side, but after that you can pass it across the line. So they're getting them moving, they're getting them working on all their techniques, but it's not in a lines. They're making decisions from the very beginning of practice. I always like to look at it. I've talked with coaches, they'll say, well, we're going to play the game at the end. That's a reward. I'd rather look at it as like a 7-course meal where the appetizer is awesome. Everything else fits in the game. And if you're playing whatever at the end, that's just that's dessert. So they all start out fun. They all start out where you're learning. You're all competing. You're making decisions. And what really started to change me was listening to a lot of podcasts, especially during COVID, where if you're home alone, great. You want to go around a cone, that's okay. But if I have people to compete against, why aren't I using them? Why are they standing in line? Why am I going to making a move on a cone? I literally saw somebody on Instagram say, here's a drill to manipulate defenders, and the kid's coming against a tripod and making a move. So who is he manipulating? It's like, I get the idea. I understand what he's trying to say. And there was 7 kids in line behind him. It's like, why not, manipulate a defender?
Yeah, no, I can imagine. I've got a game that I do with the football guys over here. It's called Skills Corridor, which is a really nice game that the younger ones love. So basically you have it's like 10 meters wide by maybe 20 meters long in a rectangle. You start 2 groups off, one at each end, and then maybe there's a couple of defenders in the middle. And basically everyone has a puck, and you've got a minute to try and get up and down as many times as you can with the puck. The defenders, if they win it, then become the attackers, and then the attacker who lost it then becomes the defenders. And I can just imagine that in terms of a skill piece of what you mentioned there, rather than having a tripod that you're just dribbling at, imagine having 5 people from the other end running towards you, and you've got to try and dodge them whilst getting your head up to figure out where you're going to put the puck. Would be far more chaotic and enjoyable, and decision making based and skillful than just going around a cone or a tripod. So yeah, I can imagine there's like a lot of crossover between football and hockey in that space to be allow those types of games to take place.
Yeah, very much so. A couple of years ago, I took over our 8U more advanced kids, and I used them basically as our lab rats. I hate to say that, but that was my lab rat. That was my laboratory. And luckily for me, the general manager of the NHL team's kid was there, and a future Hall of Famers kid was there. And they loved what I was doing because their kids loved coming to practice. And like if we were going to work on crossovers, which is a technique to go around circle to where you cross over one foot over the other to pick up speed or to go around a circle, we do like duck, duck, goose, where one kid, taps his head and he chases the other one around the circle. And we find that the crossovers would emerge because that was the best technique to get them to catch the kid in front of them. Now, when I would try to do a circle drill with these kids, it was a disaster. It was like they just didn't, either they're too busy trying to figure out what their body's doing, they're not having fun. And we did a lot more to get kids stuff to emerge. I remember doing drills where I'd throw the puck in the corner, two kids would chase it, and the idea was whoever got the puck would skate through these two tires while the other one's trying to angle them away, which is a game-like situation. And you'll get people say, well, 7 and 8-year-old can't figure it out. Well, they can. And I remember doing it, throwing the puck in the corner, watch this kid look over his shoulder to make sure he beat the other kid to the puck, steeled his body off against the wall so the other kid couldn't get the puck and skate through the tires. And I'm like, I ran up to his dad, who was an ex-NHL player, said, I can't believe what I just saw. It's like an 8-year-old making a play like a pro player would, who normally would not get a chance to even try to do that stuff until he was later, until he was much older. Or we'd play games with a ringette, which is like a big circular with a hole in the middle where they turn their stick over and they can control the puck or the ringette. So now they're not worrying about the puck and their eyes are up. And I see kids make spin moves, protect the puck like they never would. Or even worse, I never thought they had that skating technique. I didn't think they could do it. And they would just do it because that's what the situation called for.
No, I think it's a really nice, as you said, just getting those moments where you see actually this can or will work. In terms of players being pigeonholed in terms of positions and stuff, what does that look like within hockey? Because I'd say in the UK with football, we are trying to make an active effort not to go down that route, although it does still happen where people will go, oh, they're a defender, and they end up playing 95% of their minutes in defender. So what does that look like in hockey? Is that a similar issue?
Yeah, it actually is. We try to encourage coaches, especially from 10 and under, and even really a 12 and under, not to pigeonhole a kid in as a forward or a defender, because we want them to be able to play. We want them to play all different positions. The issues that happen with it is that it can affect us winning on Saturday, and so coaches get nervous. And it's not just the coaches, they get nervous because there's a lot of pressure from the parents. Or, my kid's a defenseman, well, my kid's a forward. And then it's nobody wants to be a defenseman because the goal scorers are the forwards. And, that part of saying my kid's a goal scorer. But if you watch the pro game today, it's not positionless hockey, but it's kind of interchangeable. There'll be times you're watching a hockey game and the defensemen who, while they're attacking, are down by the other team's net, both of them. And you're like, that never would have happened years ago. But it's now somebody else takes their place and they move around. So if the children actually got more of a chance to play these different positions, it would make them better. We kind of joke now in the NHL, the only way you can tell who's a defenseman is that's where they line up on the faceoff when you first start out, in the possession. Because once the game starts, everybody's moving.
Why do you think that transition's taken place? Why do you think it's become more free flowing?
I think it's, even though we're relatively tradition oriented, we look to things like soccer. I mean, this is the way the old Soviet Union teams used to play in the 70s. You didn't know who, everything was keep the puck as long as possible. We're not throwing it away. Guys are moving around. Guys are going in the zone, out of the zone. And I think, and as hockey, it also becomes especially the professional level, becomes a copycat league. So once somebody is doing that and it's successful, then other people start to follow that. Now in youth hockey, you still may see more of a traditional idea because coaches get nervous that, oh, this kid, he's not where he's supposed to be. And instead of looking at the other players and say, hey, if he moves here, you need to look and see how that affects where you go, so it's much easier to coach it the other way. And then again, the idea that most of these kids, I mean, when I would coach a lot of the kids, if we did defenseman type drills, I would have forwards being the defenseman. I didn't care. It's just, we're just learning a skill. You're 10 years old. I'm going to put you in this situation. I don't know if you're going to be a defenseman later on. Rasmus Dahlin, who was a first round pick in the NHL draft, his dad said he didn't start playing defense in Sweden until the year before the draft. So, it's like, obviously you can learn to play those positions. Now there's nuances, but those can be developed.
Yeah, I think it's really, as you mentioned, that a year before the draft seems extreme, but if you've got a technical base, particularly this in football, then it is going to support you. One thing that does fascinate me with hockey in general, and what you probably mentioned there, is around the physical side of it. So obviously hockey is an inherently physical sport. How do you, at those younger age groups and working your way through, help them understand physical contact and be more comfortable with it? I'm not saying that obviously you're going to go and smack them into a board or anything like that, but understanding that you're going to get nudges that are going to put you off balance where you might trip over, and actually embrace that, because some kids are obviously going to be inherently nervous of that type of contact.
No, that's a fantastic question, and we've really changed the way we approach with USA Hockey. We actually pushed back the age of full check, which you would think would mean, oh, we're doing less with body contact. But while we pushed that year back, and that a lot had to do with cognitive ideas of kids being able to protect themselves, we've increased the concept of body contact and really tried to push it down to the youngest ages. That, we're going to fight for pucks. We're going to bang into each other. We're going to fall down. And realistically, when a 6-year-old falls down, they don't have that far to fall. They've got all this equipment. And if they start getting used to it, then realistically, the main difference between body contact and full check is that where you're following through, you're not just battling, you're actually trying, you're trying to not launch the other player, but you're really, it's a lot more physical. But the body contact aspect of it is, you can bump, you can grind, and we're really trying to push that at the younger ages. Now, what's tough is I would hate to be an official at those ages, because it's hard to sometimes tell, is that, body check, or is that body contact? So we get confusion there, and then we get mixed signals, and then coaches are like, well, I don't want to work, I don't want to have this because my kid's going to go to the penalty box and we might get scored on. But we are really trying to push this, and by having those small area games, there's a lot more contact. We put them in smaller areas where they almost have to compete, where they have to battle for pucks, so they feel comfortable. And then if you're coaching like a 12U team, which is the last year where there is no full body check, you can start working on actual full body checking in practice, so that we're putting them in a little safer situations. We can maybe take some of the emotion out of it at first. Again, we have pushback from coaches who say, well, that's not going to help me on Saturday, or they'll say, well, if they do full check in practice, it's going to carry over to the game. Again, they don't give kids credit, because when we go throw out the puck and let them play, like in just a pickup situation, they're not blowing each other up. They know that they can't do that. So it's more of an excuse, I think, on the coaches thing. But in a game, even at the NHL level, the big hit isn't as often. And that's because we're trying to make it a possession-based game. And if we're making the big hit, not only do we knock the player off the puck, we take ourselves out of it and we don't gain possession. So we're trying to do it more where if I have initiate body contact, my goal is to come away with the puck, not just leave it out. We used to we blow them up years ago. Then it went to separate the man from the puck or the player from the puck. Now we want to gain possession of the puck through body contact.
And do you see any individuals become increasingly nervous if they've done, say, like 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 of this contact element, and then when they get to 12 and they can feel that check come in, do you see any individuals that become nervous about that? And do you guys have any strategies around that? Or is it just hoping that exposure for prolonged, actually they feel comfortable when they get to U12?
Well, it ends up happening when they turn 13 is when they start body checking. But yes, we do see kids that feel nervous. And I think some of it can actually come from some of the parents, not in a negative way, but they'll mention it to their kids, are you okay? This is going to be full body check, and the idea that a lot of programs aren't necessarily working a lot on body contact or emphasizing body contact when they're younger. So if they're coming through a program that says, okay, next year you're going to be 13, we're going to do a weekend body checking clinic and we're going to get you ready for next year. It's like that's not going to do it. I also truly believe that programs that spend more time working on decision making in small area games, those kids feel more comfortable with body contact because they're more aware. They don't get blown up as much because their eyes are up, they're seeing the situation. And the fact that USA Hockey has now, I wouldn't say we've changed our rules, we're now enforcing rules where if you don't attempt to play the puck, it's a penalty. So whereas before, you just light somebody up, they could have just let go of the puck. Well, you know what? There's like a 3-second rule and we can nail you, Now in the pro ranks, that's, different. And that's where you get some pushback. Well, when they get to the pros, well, like most of these kids aren't. So let's make it a safer environment for them and where they feel more comfortable.
Yeah, no, it makes complete sense. And then in terms of the maturation side, how are you able to manage that? Because I'd imagine you're going to have some, let's use the generic. You're going to have some defensemen who are massive and want to go around trying to light people up. And then you might have some forwards that are smaller, more agile at the moment, able to stop and change direction, are highly skillful with their decision-making and stuff. How do you manage that in terms of that disparity of size? Have you got strategies as an organization or as areas to be able to counter that? Or
again, that's always an issue because you get that one kid at 13 who's 5'9", and the other kid's still 4'6", So there's not much we can really do about that other than trying again to put kids in situations as early as possible to realize how to protect themselves. And that's part of what we do too with our body contact. It's not just about giving body contact, but how do you absorb a hit? How do you avoid putting yourself in that situation? How, if I'm a shifty, agile skater, how am I going to deceive the opponent or manipulate the defender so he can't hit me? So we try to give those players tools that, it's almost like a constraint. Well, your body is this way, so we're going to use that not as a negative, but how can you take that thing that, okay, now you got to learn to manipulate. You've got to learn how to do this so that you don't put yourself in those situations. But especially anywhere, even at our 12Us, you get a lot of kids who are huge and ones that are little. And then when they get to 13 and 14, it's like off the charts, so that does make it hard in a physical sport. I know like in football, American football, they have certain things where it's weight classifications. Ideally, maybe there are situations where you could go to where it's not necessarily age-based, but it's so hard to do that. And then you go in, I hate to say this, but then you get into situations where people manipulate that to the benefit of winning, so it's like, it's a tough thing. But again, I really do think that the more decision-making we give them, it makes it easier for players to be in a safe position.
And when you're looking at trying to prepare people for that final step, if you like, so I'm not going to say NHL because there's obviously going to be adult hockey that plays by similar rules and stuff that you're trying to prepare them for, which, you know, might not, they may get lit up or something like that. There may be, you know, more aggression, some older school things, stadiums, there might be fans, etc. Is there any particular strategies you guys use to try and help them, like when you know they're around that 16, 17, 18 years of age, where you know that that may be a next step for them and they need to understand what is coming? Is there anything you can do in that space? Is there anything you do in that space?
I would think, you know, the best way to say is we do start to cull the players as they get older, just like any other sport. So for those that may be going on to junior hockey or going on to play college or you know, be a minor pro, they're playing against more competitive players, you know, and they're playing against more highly technical players. And so, and they may play at those ages, whether it's good or not, anywhere from 50 to 80 games. Some teams may play more, you know, so they're getting used to, you know, they'll see that kind of competition. They'll understand where it's coming from. And then in the practices, we're really trying to change the concept of it. We used to always hear from college coaches or pro coaches, these kids need to compete more. They, you know, we want kids that compete. You know, we always have the big word. I want smart players who compete. And then we'd go back and look at our practices, and we weren't doing anything to force them to compete. We'd start drills with a puck on your stick instead of like, well, you got to go get it, you know? So as we change our practices and make them more competitive, make it where they're maybe in small areas where they, you know, you're gonna have to bang for pucks. You're gonna have to play what we call along the wall, which is or the yellow, which is that yellow strip along the bottom of the boards on the rink. Is they're gonna have so many more repetitions in that, you know, physical part of the game that it becomes second nature, and also takes away some of the fear. Because one of the things you learn in hockey, and I know that I did because I played at $125. I mean, I was 125 pounds when I was 18, was it didn't hurt as much as I thought it did. The anticipation was way worse than actually doing it, but we didn't do it in practice. It's like, we're not, you know, so it's like the only time I'd see it would be on the weekend and some 175 guys coming after me. And I'm like, whoa, you know, this isn't going to be good. So, but now we're doing everything we can to force them to compete, force body contact at, you know, at all ages.
I like the idea of having it where they don't start with a puck as well, or they don't start with a thing. Can you turn that into a battle before you then try and do a particular technique? And obviously, you mentioned earlier about that race to then get through the tires or something like that. I think that's a really nice piece, which you can utilize in a lot of sports. I'm thinking of football now. You could do that. You could do that in basketball if you needed to. You could do that in rugby. There's loads of different sports that involve contact that actually you could have it as the first bit is, can we gain possession of the ball before we then figure out what we're actually trying to achieve within the skill session. So yeah, that's a really nice piece.
When I teach our coaching education classes, I often ask like do you guys have an issue with your team, one of your players going to get the puck? And some will raise their hand, and I'll just say quickly, you're all liars who didn't raise your hand, because we all have that issue. But I said, then how many drills do we start where the kid has the puck on his stick? I mean, even if you want to do a drill that is isolated, why not start it by them going to get the puck, you know, throwing it, they have to go get it. You know, it's not, because in our sport, you never start with the puck on your stick. I mean, it's not like after a goal, they give it to you like in basketball and you start. You got to go get it. And we don't look at that aspect of our practices sometimes as an important part of our game.
Yeah, no, I'm thinking now I do a lot of 1v1s where it starts where the person who defends gives it to the attacker. It's actually not a great precedent to set, because you're saying you've given the ball away, you've got to go and get it back. Whereas it could be actually the ball has just not fallen to you. Can you get it back? It's a small distinction, but actually makes quite a bit of difference, I think. Lost my train of thought there. No, I know what I was going to say. In terms of at the very top level, and you're looking at those NHL teams, how much support or notice, etc., do they place on the regional hockey? So did they do anything to actively help the community, or is it more of a pay-to-play model, as you mentioned earlier? And then when they get to the point where they might begin to draft them, then they'll pay interest in college and all that type of stuff.
So the NH, like I worked for an NHL team. We had a youth program. So their involvement, what I mean, there's not a ton of involvement. I'm not saying there wasn't any, the NHL programs are more like into grassroots where they're building fans. They'll have try hockey for free programs like the Panthers, Florida Panthers. We ran a try hockey for free program where for like $150, or no, I think it went up to $200, they would get 6 classes and all the gear, which the gear itself costs more than the class. But was because that's a barrier for people to join. It's like, I'm not going to buy all this hockey gear and then have my kid go on the ice and not want to do it. And what was also good about the program is the length of it, because very often that first week you got a lot of crying kids. It's like, what am I doing? I'm lost. But then once they do it, then by week 6 they show some proficiency, and now, okay, yeah, this is fun. So that the NHL is doing an excellent job in that aspect of it. But unlike European clubs, it's not like we have an academy for each team that's these players they're being groomed to move up the ladder to that team. North American system is very different. And we don't have, like, even certain areas, there's no access to the NHL team. The NHL, again, will send out these learn to play programs fairly large distances depending on where they are, but it's not as active, or the idea that, I'm grew up playing hockey in Florida, that I'm going to be playing for the Florida Panthers. Now, we have had some kids that have actually gone through our program and played for the Florida Panthers, but that's more happenstance than, planned. That's where they got drafted.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting time, because, as you said, the American model is so different to the academy system. And I know some of the MLS clubs are trying to bring it in the soccer context, but you've got the NCAA, for example, which is such a powerhouse that actually a lot of the players are going to go there because their local college teams who they've always wanted to play for, or they want to go to Duke or want to go to Stanford, and then they want to get into the pro ranks that way rather than going via the MLS. So it's really interesting to hear that they probably do. The NHL teams probably do better than what we do over here, which is like real grassroots bits of supporting people as an entry level, because they know that's how you're going to get fans and bums on seats, more so than it being we'll get you in because you're going to be a 9-year-old who's signed to our academy.
Yeah, and our our college market has changed now so much with with the likeness, the NILs, where a kid can be now in college and making $1 million based off of his likeness. So that's, there may not be that rush to get to the NFL. We know that I can stay, or I can stay in college another year, and I might actually make more because I may be a bust at the pro level, but I'm really successful at the college level. And that's changing, way people are approaching stuff, even with the transfer portals now, where kids play, can leave a school after one, go wherever they want. That I saw a thing today where college recruiters, they don't give out, like if they had 20 scholarships, they would have 20 scholarships for freshmen. Well, they don't do that anymore. They hold 5 or 6 for the transfer portal. So now where these young kids going, they don't know, there's less opportunity sometimes to break in.
Yeah, no, it is interesting. I can't remember the name of the kid, but he mentioned how, I think today, he goes, if you offered any general person a 10 grand wage rise, they take it, because that's why I'm going to Kansas. I'm getting more money.
Yeah, man, I'm an alumni from Kansas, so I'm okay with that. So
Yeah, so it was a real interesting one that I read, that I come across. In terms of, I guess, the future of the game, then you've mentioned a little around at the top level, I guess interchanging of positions, it becoming more fluid, obviously kind of throughout the pathway in terms of some strategies to try and make it more competitive at times, but also trying to stagnate that across, and the approach rather than being so drill based. Where do you think this will end up for US hockey in comparison to what the Europeans are currently doing?
I think what's happening now is everyone in the world is going to this more fluid style of play. It used to be in hockey too that you'd have your top six forwards were the ones that were really skillful. Your third line could do either, and your fourth line was what we call checkers, very much defensive specialists. Now every line can score. Now, the fourth line is still got incredibly skilled athletes. Now they still may have a different posture in the team where they are used in more defensive situations, but they're still an offensive threat. Defensemen used to be if you were big and strong and you could just, it used to be if you stood in front of the net, it was legal to basically mug you, and as the rules tightened up, it changed that. We have a lot of top level NHL defensemen who are 5'10", 5'11". That was unheard of. I remember talking to my son's junior coach about he was really skilled and very good at getting the team out of his zone by making really good passes, and finding open guys. And I asked him because he would use them on the power play to do that, where he will start more lineup as a defenseman. So, do you ever think about making him a defenseman on the teams? Oh no, he's not big enough. Today that wouldn't have mattered. So I think it's just going to get almost more fluid. But what happens in the pro ranks too is coaches want to keep their jobs, so they're going to find a way to try to defend against it. And that's what always seems to happen. Anytime there's a big offensive change, the coaches try to find ways to make it so almost like boring so they can stop it, but with the skill of the players, it's almost like they're going to demand that it continues to at least evolve this way, because it's more fun to play. And that's what also I think is a really good, makes that a really good question is part of the issue has been in hockey, and it may have been in other sports too, is if we're training our kids now to play the game the way it is right now, by the time they get to play the pro game, it's going to be different anyway. So we're trying to, or a lot of coaches now are trying to, if we can create players that can compete and make decisions, no matter how the game evolves, they'll still be successful.
Sorry, I'm laughing as you were talking there because I used to play the NHL game when I was a kid, and you talking about the big defensive lineman who used to go around hitting people. I just remembered I had a flashback of Chris Pronger, who I used to like playing with, because he literally would be the best guy. You could put him in front of the net, and then he would come past it. You could give him a whack with him, and they'd go absolutely flying.
Yep.
And I used to watch clips on YouTube, and it was very much that. He had a good ability to intimidate opponents. Yeah, in terms of that fluidity, I think that's something that seems more and more paramount across sports, and having that. How do you encourage coaches to try and future-proof their players? So you can say, like, listen, this is what we think the game is going to look like in 10, 15 years. Because it almost goes against their conventional wisdom, as you mentioned. Defensive coaches, we want defensive people that are going to be able to keep me in a job. But also, if a lot of coaches will go in because they used to play, and they'll go, well, this is what worked for me, or this is what I learned, etc. So how do you, in your coach development role, go, listen, this is what we think the future game's looking like. This is why your players need to be able to solve problems, or need to be able to make decisions, or need to do all of these other aspects that you might not have had exposure to, because ultimately this is where we think it's going to end up.
That's a really good question, especially for somebody like me, because my issue used to be, and I'm really working hard to get away from it, where as I'd look at coaches like, don't you see this? Why haven't you figured it? Because again, in my role, and I was very lucky where I could spend a couple hours a day reading, studying, and seeing this. And so I try now to go to coaches like, hey, you developed a lot of really good players. We make them better. You know, do you think they could be better? Like, here's what are you trying to accomplish here? And I'm not saying in a condescending way, like, hey, what do you really think you're doing here? It's like, okay, what is that? What's your goal in this? And then they say, this is what I'm trying to get. Is there a different way to get this where we're going to add some decisions, or we're going to add some, competition, and then almost not stroke their ego, but say, you know, I want to, I think you can come up with even a more creative way, to do it. And then when they, or we'll joke around and say, hey, we were doing these same drills, 15, 20 years ago, and the game's changed, and I'm finding sometimes it's better to have those conversations in a non-threatening situation, maybe where a bunch of guys are around, maybe, sitting around having a beer and a pizza, as opposed to sitting in a room at the rink where somebody stands up front with a PowerPoint showing you why this is better. It's not me telling you that you're terrible or what you're doing is bad, but how can we just make it better? I heard one of the great skills trainers who works for the Pittsburgh Penguin, Ty Hennis, was saying, okay, so you want to do line skating drills, all right? How about you have one line going this way, another line going that way, and maybe another line going this way? So you're still doing your technique, but what have we added? Oh, we've added decision making. We've added having our head up. We've added that if I'm going to do a technique, I have to adjust it and adapt it during a game anyway. So, that way they're still getting what they feel that they need, which is that, that repetitive thing, but they're doing it in a different way. Because again, like no matter how the game evolves, a player who's intelligent and has a what we call high hockey IQ, and then as a compete level, will adjust to whatever the game is, and will be able to adjust whatever a coach asks them to do.
And how do you manage that dynamic, I guess, when you come culturally very different situations? Obviously, you're down in Florida. If you're going up to a guy from Minnesota who has a different experience of that, is it very similar, or going, oh, okay, I'm just going to try and skillfully say, how could we make what you do even better? Or how do you manage that dynamic? Because the one thing like we have it in the UK, you have the South, Midlands, and North, and there's a little bit of rivalry depending where you are. America's so big, like someone from LA is going to have a different experience to someone in Florida compared to New York, and some of them will be only rinks inside, whereas others might be able to lake skate. Like, it's so different. How do you manage that dynamic in terms of the different cultures in the different regions?
Well, you definitely get different areas like this is the way we do it, and we produce more players, and then you stop and you think that, well, you've got 5,000 more players at that age than I do. So, and we get the reverse a lot. My practices won't have line skating. And then I get a parent come and tell me, well, this program up in Michigan that's really successful does line skating. So why aren't you? So obviously you're wrong and they're right. And I try to diplomatically say, well, they've got, hundreds more players at our age group. So it's more like those kids are surviving that than they are getting better because of that. And so you run into that thing then if you go up north, well, see, look at all these players that we've had, why should we change? And we kind of joke with them, like when we do, so what we do now, which is very interesting. This is a good, good point with it. When we do our CEP or our coaching education classes, they're by Zoom. I used to go out and do them with like a lot of coaches in my area or in the South, but now coaches from all over the country are exposed to me or my group. Like there'll be 4 of us from the Southeast teaching people that are from Alaska, from Boston, from Minnesota, from Michigan. So we get them all together and we can start talking about certain things like about not, making decisions happen more often, or with the teams that are like from Minnesota where kids do have the opportunities to get on the pond is like, well, okay, you're from California, your kids can't skate outside. So we got to bring the pond inside. We have to, do those things to catch up to that. Or you're in New Mexico, you may have, 80 kids in your program. So how are you going to get the most out for those 80 kids? You may have to do these kinds of things. So I think it's going to be the Zoom part of it, although not as interactive maybe as we'd like. although it is fairly interactive, but not as like being in person, brings in this vast country and have all these different people from all different areas on there together discussing, what things they do. And we're exposing a lot of newer coaches to new concepts. What we're hearing, though, is a lot of these coaches who learning the new concepts, they really think they're great. They go back and they're an assistant coach, and the head coach, like, no, we're not going to do that. This is what I do, So it's getting back to educating those older coaches, but USA Hockey has now added a continuing education aspect that even after you reach your highest level, you have to get so many credits over so many years continually about, which we're hoping to then expose coaches to new ideas.
Yeah, it sounds similar to what we have with the FA in England. Every season you have to have 5 hours worth of CPD. Now you can acute that to your club, so I do it via Southampton, or you have to go on to courses run by the FA that allow you to accrue those 5 hours. But it is that constant learning of new ideas, new principles, new pedagogical research, all of that type of stuff, which supports the players. I'm conscious of time and where we are in this. So last question for me. If I were to speak to the coaches you work with or support or any of your players, how would you hope they described you in 3 words, and why?
I think they would passionate. I'm definitely very into what I do and the game and coaching. I think too they would. It's 2 words, but forward thinking or constantly learning. They are always hearing from me about what the newest thing that I learned that I'd listened to or that part. And then caring. I want my players all know that I want them to get better, and that whatever we're doing is to try to get them better. And I care about them as people as much as I do. They're people first and then a player second. Same with my coaches.
Perfect. Listen, Jim, really appreciate your time. I think a really good insight into obviously US hockey and some strategies and stuff moving forward, and definitely one we could catch up again over a period of time and see how it's progressing and what the world of hockey is doing. So yeah, really appreciate your time, and hopefully catch up with you again further down the road.
Thank you for having me on.
Thanks for listening to the Sports Initiative podcast with me, Michael Wright. Please remember to follow us on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram at the Sports Initiative Podcast, and share this podcast with friends and family. I'll see you next week.